Hello and welcome to the channel Division 24. Today with an episode in English language with German subtitles. Heute eine englischsprachige Version mit deutschen Untertiteln. What do offenders need to desist from crime in the future? Everybody knows prisons, but prisons in many cases are not the right means to reach this goal. There are alternatives, for example, probation and other community sanctions and measures. We talk to experts in this field. Today we travel to Glasgow in Scotland to meet Fergus McNeill. Fergus is professor at the University of Glasgow. Among his numerous publications, today we want to talk about his groundbreaking book, Pervasive Punishment. In the first part of the interview, we talk to Fergus about his life, his convictions, his beliefs, and also about the question why he committed his professional life to criminal justice. In the second part of the interview, we want to dig deeper into two aspects of his book, Pervasive Punishment. The first aspect is the question of net widening and mass supervision. And the second aspect relates to creativity in working with offenders in probation. If you like the interview, leave us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. My name is Joe, and I would say, let's go. So we'll start. Good morning, Fergus. We're meeting at the University of Glasgow today. Thanks for having invited me here. I'm very happy about that. It's the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. Yeah. Maybe we talk about that a little bit later. The School of Social and Political Science. Long name.
Yeah.
We want to talk among the numerous books and publications you've made. We want to focus on one thing, on your publication Pervasive Punishment. So the main topic is the question, can there be too much supervision of criminal offenders? I think that's, for me, it's the core question of the book. Mm-hmm. But before we have a closer look into this question, we want to know who's Fergus McNeill, what was your personal development that led you to become a professor interested in probation in criminal justice. How did that come about, and what are your maybe convictions or beliefs? You know, what in your life made you choose to go this way? So I would actually, and I couldn't read anything in your CV about that, but I would actually start with the question where you were born and raised, what your family looked like, how your life at school went. And yesterday we already talked about also some religious career you made as a young person. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that, and if there were points or role models or certain experiences you made that led you to go the way you went in the end.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was born not far from Glasgow and raised in a small town called Barrhead. Which was famous for nothing very much except a toilet factory, the Armitage Shanks factory, and also a cat food factory.
Where's Barrhead? I don't know.
It's southwest of Glasgow, maybe about 10 miles, so it really in the kind of greater Glasgow area. And I grew up I was born in 67, so I grew up through the 70s and the 80s in that town during the period of deindustrialisation. And it was I guess that town's a microcosm of Scottish society. There's a rich neighbourhood, a middling neighbourhood where I grew up, a working class neighbourhood, and then a very poor neighbourhood, 4 neighbourhoods in one town. And I went through state education there, I went to the local high school, and as a result I think I was well educated in a social sense. Like, I met lots of people from different backgrounds and who were having different life experiences and struggles. At home, my parents were both working class children, at least, who were the first of their families to go to university. They both went to Glasgow University, and they both ended up with PhDs in chemistry. My dad was an academic, my mum was a high school teacher, and I'm the youngest of 3 siblings, although our family is also slightly unusual in that my elder siblings were both adopted, whereas I was a kind of unexpected, accidental, later arrival, would be the best way to put it. And we were brought up in the knowledge of that. And I think maybe one effect of that was that I was always acutely aware of or questioning whether or not we were being treated the same. So I had a kind of interest in...
Your siblings and yourself.
Yeah, I had an interest in justice within the family. And also my parents inculcated within me a social conscience and an interest in both politics and religion. My dad had been brought up himself in socialist Sunday school by parents who were part of the Independent Labour Party, Red Clydesiders we call them in this city, so strongly socialist and strongly atheist. My mum had been brought up in a Christian working class family, but also more leaning to the political left. My dad adopted religion as part of his courtship, I guess. But he always took a very scientific approach to questions of faith. So I was brought up in the church, and as we were discussing yesterday, in my teenage years I kind of made my faith my own, but had lots of struggles with that. As soon as I was exposed to theology, I was asking complicated questions about divine justice. And then when I came to university, which I did quite young, at the age of 16, just about 17, I started studying philosophy and history, and I got hooked on questions of political and moral philosophy, and also studied the philosophy of religion. So my interest in justice kind of evolved more in a social justice direction. And after the first degree, I didn't know what to do, but I knew I didn't want to study again immediately. So I volunteered to work, volunteered with an agency which decided to place me in a residential drug rehab. And that was supposed to be 1 year as a live-in junior staff member.
Just to get a little bit to know about your religious career,
Sure.
what kind of church background was that you were active in? You said you were about 13 when you started to find an interest in
I was about 13. I mean, I'd always had, I'd kind of acquired or inherited some sort of belief in God, I suppose, or the sense of there being some larger thing. But around the age of 13, there was a group of young people who were all kind of drawn to a more evangelical form of Christianity, and I got involved with that for a good few years before I found its narrowness too confining, and some of the kind of social and political aspects of how that version of Christianity was being articulated in Scotland didn't sit easily with me by my late teens, really. So I kind of moved away from that version of Christianity, but stayed involved with what is essentially a Presbyterian church in Scotland. The Church of Scotland is a Presbyterian church which is influenced by Lutheranism and Calvinism. So it's historically important in Scotland because it kind of feeds into the Scottish Enlightenment. And so the philosophers I was studying, although some of them were already, by the 18th century, atheists, the only reason they were educated was because the church had wanted everyone to be able to read and interpret the Bible for themselves. So the pursuit of universal education in Scotland was a result of the Reformation. And so there's a kind of deep legacy of Christian culture and influence, which is part of my DNA, even if I'm not now an active churchgoer. And
was that way something that was common among your peers?
Well, I would say a minority of my peers would have gone to church, but at the time that was a kind of, this was the 1960s and 70s, that was still a kind of social habit. It didn't mean that people had deeply held beliefs. So actually, in the teenage years when I met people with deeply held beliefs who were serious about pursuing a life that conformed to a set of ideals, I was very drawn by that, as many young people are. So I think that was what made me interrogate questions of faith more personally and involve myself with Christianity in a different way. Yeah, so...
Okay. So, and then, as you said, you started to go to university very early. I mean, 16 is really very early.
Yeah.
Studying history and philosophy.
Yeah.
And after having finished that, you started the drug rehab career right away?
Yeah, so in Scotland you can go to university if you get good enough grades from the 5th year of high school.
Okay.
Whereas it's more normal to go after 6 years, but you can go, and I got the grades to do what I wanted to do, and I couldn't really see any reason for hanging about, so I went, and in a way it was a mistake because I was far too young to engage with the sort of social life of the university.
And all that was in Glasgow?
Yeah, so again, my parents were kind of deeply invested in Glasgow University. It had been their liberation, and I think they genuinely believed it was the best university in the world. Why would you go anywhere else? So I didn't really have any great desire to leave home at that age, being so young, so I stayed at home. My dad was working in Glasgow University, so it was super convenient and easy. Obviously, as I went through the 4 years, I wanted to stretch my wings and started to live in student flats, and as I was a bit older, began to enjoy more of the student lifestyle. But the positive of going to university so early was that I graduated at 20, which meant that I had some time, I reasoned, to think about what I wanted to do with my life, and I had done very well in my first degree, so I could have gone straight into a PhD if I had wanted. But I'd been studying ideas for 4 years, and I wanted to do something practical. I wanted to see whether or not I had the ability to live up to the ideas and ideals that I'd been trying to clarify for 4 years, hence the volunteering. And I ended up staying in that residential drug rehab for 3 years. It was a remarkable place and a remarkable practical education. I met people from all over the United Kingdom and further afield who were mostly men who had long-term addictions to opiates, sometimes alcohol, sometimes other substances.
And just to get that clear, was that a further education, a formalized education, or was that a job you took up?
That was a job, so there was no training other than on-the-job training.
And you got it without being a social worker?
Yeah, I mean it was a not-for-profit or a voluntary organisation that was running the rehab. They did. Towards the end of my time there, they allowed me to go on a day release course at Oxford, where I studied a certificate of multidisciplinary studies of drug misuse.
Okay.
And that actually was important because it turned me on to social work education and made me kind of curious to study social work, which I came back to Glasgow to do in my early 20s, still in my early 20s, 23 to 25 I think I would have been when I was training. Did my MSW, and it was on those placements, the practical placement parts of the social work course, were my sort of first serious encounters with criminal justice, like writing court reports, pre-sentence reports, and supervising probation orders, and I was hooked, because as soon as I kind of realised that criminal justice was like a crucible in which all of the moral and political philosophy that I'd been studying played out in the real world with real world consequences, and I could bring everything I'd learned from my studies and from my practical experience in the rehab to bear on trying to play a part in the delivery of justice. So yeah, I was, as soon as I kind of found myself doing criminal justice work, I knew that's what I wanted to do as a social worker. It wasn't usual at that time to be able to go straight into criminal justice work. In the 1980s and 90s in Scotland, you were expected as a generically qualified social worker to focus first on children and families. I think I was the first to kind of fight against that, and I couldn't demand, but I tried to demand that I immediately became a criminal justice social worker, and somehow I persuaded the boss in the team that I worked for to let me do that. So I was 80% of my time was criminal justice work, and 20% was more generic social work, from
So you did
from
that from 93 to 98, so 5
That's right.
years of practical work. And,
That's right.
And it's not, as far as I understood your CV, it's not a probation service in the narrow sense of the word, but it was like a municipal service for social work.
Yeah,
so did everything. Yeah.
That's right. There's a long story about this, but in short, in the late 1960s, Scotland disbanded its probation services and integrated them within generic social work departments in municipalities, and we have 32 municipalities in a country of 6 million people, so really quite local government structures where the same department was dealing with children and families, child protection, people with disabilities, older people, and people caught up in criminal justice.
And that's still the case?
Still the case, although the sub-specialism of criminal justice social work has a kind of clearer and more distinct identity now because of the way that it's funded and managed, but it still sits within those structures.
It's interesting because in many states in Germany we have the same system, but only for juvenile probation services, not for the adults.
Well, it was part of a philosophical move in the 60s where we were understanding young people's behavioural problems as something that needed to be addressed through social education rather than through punishment or repression. And so it made sense at that time to co-locate these services with people who had a skill set that enabled social development. And that logic applied as much to adults as it did to children, or so they thought. Although having implemented those reforms, it turned out that the judges in Scotland weren't so keen on sending adult offenders to social workers. So it actually took 20 odd years and special funding to kind of recreate a sort of probation service within those structures that judges would trust. So yeah, it was a complicated story.
Okay, so you did 5 years of practical work, and what made you decide then that you rather do scientific work than spending more time in practice?
I wouldn't even have put it that way at the time, because I loved practice and I was still enjoying it. But I had done another master's degree when I was a practitioner, which was more specialised, more criminological, and that had kind of refreshed and renewed my academic zeal, which had never gone away. I've always been interested in study for its own sake, but also very interested in the practical application of ideas. So at the end of that master's degree, which was 1998, a job came up at Glasgow University to train people in criminal justice social work. And I'd had my eye on that as a potential move almost as soon as I qualified as a social worker, and I knew that there were only 2 or 3 of those jobs in the country, so I figured if I didn't apply for it I might have to wait 10 years. So I applied and I was successful, and I think I thought I might do it for a while and then go back to practice, or I thought I might try and find a way to do both jobs. But once I was in the academic environment and developing my career as a researcher, it was pretty obvious to me that my skills and strengths were better aligned with the job I now do than the job I had been doing back then. I think I was an okay social worker, but I think I'm a better academic. Okay.
And can you tell us a little bit more about how that career went? When did you make your PhD? When did you become a professor? What were the main topics you were concerned with in the beginning, and how did that develop?
Yeah,
why?
That was also unusual because at that time in the UK, back in the 90s, you could still get into a lectureship in social work largely because of your practice experience, as long as your academic track record was good enough. You didn't need to have a PhD to be appointed, and so I was appointed without a PhD but with 2 master's degrees, and with the expectation that I would be pursuing research and trying to publish. And so I embarked on a PhD in 2001, I think, or maybe even earlier. I registered to do a PhD part-time alongside my lectureship, and I got quite a long way through that PhD. I collected all the data and was analysing it. But I was overtaken by success in gaining external grants. So as soon as you have external grants, you have to prioritise the work for the funders. And that also led to lots of publications. So the PhD sort of stayed on the shelf for a while, and then eventually around about 2006 I realised that I could do a PhD by publication. And there were already some publications from the original PhD study and many more publications from other work. So I applied and was granted permission to switch track into the PhD by publication, assembled a thesis which actually had, I think it had 13 publications in it, and then a narrative to introduce the thesis as a whole. And it was called Changing Paradigms in Criminal Justice Social Work, which was a kind of clever title because it was descriptive in the first half. How was social work changing in the criminal justice system in Scotland? And the second half was prescriptive. How should it change? Based largely on desistance research findings and my kind of analysis of their practice implications. So that was the PhD, and I think I got the PhD in 2007, and the professorship followed quite quickly afterwards. I think because the publication success and the grant income and all the other boxes were being adequately ticked. So I was encouraged to apply, and I think I got my professorship just before my 40th birthday, so that must have been, that would have been 2007. So, yeah.
And did you ever think of changing the university? I mean, your whole career is connected to Glasgow, and when I have a look at the academic world, many of your colleagues, at least once or twice in their life changed the place they work at.
Yeah, I've sometimes had itchy feet, as we say in English, a desire to kind of move. And from time to time I've got as far as applying for different jobs, but there have always been either family reasons or other reasons to stay put in Glasgow. I love Glasgow. It's an amazing city to live in with a fantastic quality of life, I think. And also Glasgow University has been good to me and good for me. I have 3 degrees from Glasgow University, and as I said, my parents met at Glasgow University. I met my wife at Glasgow University. If you cut me, I bleed Glasgow University. So it would be a big wrench to move elsewhere. Recently, actually, as a result of Brexit, I kind of thought about whether I wanted to spend my whole career in the United Kingdom, and I started looking at possibilities of maybe working somewhere in continental Europe. And that led to me eventually being appointed as a visiting professor at the University of Leiden, and I did that partly to enter a different university context, a different academic culture, and work with different people. And that's been fantastic. I've thoroughly enjoyed that, but I can combine that with my substantive post at Glasgow, so I think I'm likely to stay here unless they want rid of me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also asking this question because you're internationally very active and you have a wide international network. And what is it that you like about international cooperation? Or maybe it's what's necessary, maybe even.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been fascinated by understanding how people in different countries take on similar challenges in different ways, and I've always been frustrated by what I see as a British tendency to be myopic and narrowly focused on how things are done here. So when work gave me opportunities to travel, and this largely occurred because the work I'd done on desistance was attracting international attention, so I was being invited to go and talk about desistance in different countries. And I always tried to enter those places and spaces with a degree of humility and say, look, this needs to be a dialogue because the ideas I'm bringing may or may not transfer to your context. And as those dialogues developed, I found myself endlessly fascinated, both by what I learned about other countries and also how that reflects back on how you think about your own. Once you travel, you understand where you're from better. And that's as true of criminal justice as it is of life in general. That's why travel enriches all of us, I think. So in the last 10 years, I've been very drawn to comparative research, including the comparative research which informed the development of the book. And I think that's helped me to understand what is unusual and peculiar and distinctive about Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Last biographical personal question I ask everybody I talk to is the question whether you have any personal experience as a criminal offender, and if so, if that have, in which way this might have influenced, the way you think about also probation and sanctioning.
I mean, there's a great American website, I don't know if you've come across it, called We Are All Criminals, where they invite people anonymously to disclose the things that they've done and not been prosecuted for. And it's a nice way of subverting the false dichotomy between so-called criminals and so-called law-abiding people. So I think, like almost everybody else, I've committed offences. The ones that come to mind are mostly traffic offences. So I've picked up a few speeding tickets in my time. The closest I've got to being prosecuted was when I failed to get my car inspected. If you have an old car in the UK, you have to go through an annual inspection. And the date fell in a holiday period when we were out of the country. And very embarrassingly, we returned home. My wife was driving the car and a truck hit her. And when we were invited to present our documents to the police to pursue the case, we discovered that the certification on our vehicle was out of date. So I was then charged with causing my wife to drive without a MOT certificate, as it's called.
And that's a criminal offence?
Yeah, it is potentially a criminal offence. She was charged with driving without an MOT. She still hasn't forgiven me. But as often happens, the prosecutor in Scotland looked at the paperwork and decided not to prosecute and just sent me a letter saying, don't do that again. Probably because I had no previous convictions and would have looked on paper like the sort of respectable middle-class person that doesn't usually get prosecuted. So I escaped by virtue of my privilege, I would say. As a teenager, I remember punching somebody in the head once, impulsively. I also remember being punched in the head randomly in the street. I've been a victim of crimes of several different types over the years.
Any crimes that were prosecuted?
No. No, I don't think any of the things that happened to me ever found their way into court. I certainly didn't report them. Well, 2 domestic burglaries, break-ins in our house. I would have reported those because you needed to make an insurance claim. But in fact, there have been 3 of those in my experience. 4. 1 at my family home when I was growing up, 2 in a flat, and then 1, the most frightening one, was when we had small children in the house and somebody came into the house at night and stole some phones and computers, but none of us woke up. So that, I mean, I think I have everyday experiences of crime from different perspectives, but also lots of involvement with criminal justice, obviously, both as a practitioner and as an academic.
I mean, having burglars in your house with children, that's an offence that does many things to many people, and it seems like you're not very affected by this experience.
I think maybe because, well, actually, probably because I've worked with a lot of people who've committed those offences, and therefore they're not anonymously frightening to me. They're just people who probably have problems, So I think it's maybe professional familiarity with criminal justice is a kind of slight antidote to the fear of crime that many people would have. So
That's an interesting thought, but I think, yeah, that's relevant. If you know people who commit those crimes and you know that these can be very nice and sympathetic people as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks very much. Now we make a little cut and turn to the professional part of our interview. Okay, Fergus, let's start with the second part of our interview that's mainly about your publication, Pervasive Punishment. There are a lot of topics in this book, so I think we have to focus on some things, and especially for the German discussion, I would say it's relevant to focus on the question of what you start with, of the net widening effect, and also about the question whether probation or community supervision can be something harmful as well, because this is not necessarily a thought judges, politicians, even probation professionals have. And to tell you the truth, the discussion you start here or you lead here is not a discussion that's widely active in Germany. So I think for us it's quite interesting to get a little bit more to know about this discussion from you. And I think partly it may have to do with the fact that the German statistics are not complete in the sense of the Council of Europe statistics. I think that you also referred to, because Germany isn't visible there very much, and I'm not completely sure whether the figures that you present for Scotland and also for other European countries would apply in the same way in Germany. But we'd have to have a look into that. So maybe the first thing that would be good for our audience would be to, if you explained this idea of, or not the idea, also the statistics of net widening and what that could, or what that exactly means.
Yeah, so the term is most associated with the work of Stanley Cohen in his book Visions of Social Control from the 1980s. But there were already before him a series of people who had started to write about transcarceration, so carceral as in the prison or the cage, literally in Latin, I think, and transcarceration, the movement of the cage from one place to another, if you like. And those scholars had started to notice the way in which systems of community-based punishment or community-based supervision had started to develop rapidly in Western countries. In the post-war years, but particularly the critical attention emerged in the 1970s and 80s. And I think this was largely inspired by Foucault's work on Discipline and Punish in that book, famous book, where he talked about modalities of punishment in modern societies shifting towards this disciplinary mode of operation that classified and categorized and sought to condition change within individuals so that they would become compliant or docile subjects. And that technique of, I guess you could call it normalization, you might call it rehabilitation, you might call it correction, which is the word that the Americans would use. That set of techniques would produce a docile population who were no threat to the social order of the day, hence the sort of critical take. So Cohen applied that kind of thinking, looking at the emergence of systems of what were supposed to be supervision and support, but his argument was that these systems weren't doing what they were supposed to do, which was to displace the use of more punitive, more controlling mechanisms so that we had less imprisonment, less repression. Instead, rates of imprisonment stayed much the same, while forms of community-based supervision and surveillance grew rapidly. So the total net of penal control in the two spheres, custodial and community-based, grew instead of contracting. And the policymakers were arguing for contraction. The practitioners thought that they were pursuing diversion, but actually the effect was often the opposite. And in the book, I take Scotland as my case study because it was the story in which I was myself complicit. So I was practicing in the 1990s. Nobody had taught me about net widening when I started writing court reports. And I can still remember cases. I could talk you through cases where I, young and enthusiastic and full with my box of social work tricks at my disposal, was convinced I could help people. So I argued for courts to put those people on orders under my supervision so that I could provide that assistance. And then,
but isn't it something that might also be true in a way, that if you offer social work, it might help people?
Yes, but it might also harm them. And in many cases, the harm was that either for one reason or another, my help didn't prove effective, or they didn't comply with the conditions of the order that the court had set, and they then found themselves subject to potentially more severe punishment than they would have received at the first instance. So I can think of a young woman, for example, who I suggested a court place her under probation so that I could support her. And shamefully, part of the logic here, a senior social worker in my office said it would be good if we got her on supervision, because last year we did an investigation into a non-accidental injury or a potential non-accidental injury on one of the children, and although that came to nothing and we couldn't justify any further intervention, it would be good if you could keep an eye on the kids. And I was green enough not to think about whether or not the fusing of the welfare and the penal system was legitimate. So I said, okay, I'll see what I can do. She was placed on probation. I did my best to try to help her. I should say her offences were very trivial and probably didn't merit a probation order. Obviously she failed to comply. Eventually I had to submit the breach report. I tried to encourage her to attend court when she was called. She did not attend court. A warrant was issued for her arrest. I tried to encourage her to surrender to the warrant so that she wouldn't be detained. She didn't do that. And she ended up being arrested by the police and placed in custody for about a month, during which time her two children ended up removed from her, obviously. So that was, to me, that's an instance of net widening, and of the kind of illegitimate fusion of a penal apparatus employed for a kind of dubious welfare purpose, but with a consequence which was deeply serious for that woman and for her children. To set the example aside, in Scotland the general picture was we brought in special funding for criminal justice social work because we wanted to reduce the prison population. We had overcrowded prisons then, as we do now. We had high rates of suicide, a lot of prison riots, hostage takings. Prisons were big news and bad news for Scottish politicians in the 1980s. So they put money into alternatives, quote unquote, and they made the alternatives more credible, quote unquote. And then as a social worker, I set about trying to encourage the use of these alternatives. And what happened was the prison population rose, and the population subject to supervision rose enormously. So to give you the basic numbers, in Scotland in 1980, there were about 5,000 people in prison and about 3,000 people subject to community sanctions. By 2015-16, just before the book was published, we had about 8,000 people in prison and about 21,000 to 22,000 people under different kinds of supervision, either front-end community sanctions or post-release supervision. So the total number of people subject to correctional control, again to use the American language, had gone from 8,000 to 30,000 in that time period, making us, on those European statistics, look like, as my friend and colleague Sarah Armstrong put it, we now look like the Texas of Europe. Albeit, you know, the numbers pale in comparison with American numbers, but comparatively in the European context, we had this enormous population subject to different forms of penal control. And for most of the period in question, the crime rate had been stable or falling. So this seems like a paradox.
I come from a state in Germany that has considerably lower figures than the one you just referred to in Scotland. Schleswig-Holstein is about half the size, and we have about 1,000 prisoners and maybe around about 4,000, depending on the definition, maybe 5,000 people on community supervision. So it's lower figures. And when I talk to victim support workers, which I did a lot during my professional career, I very often hear the story that they do not understand why courts are not, ordering more sentences, no matter whether it's prison sentences or community supervision, for people who otherwise won't respect the criminal justice system. And they very often refer to cases of domestic violence or sexual violence where courts are not very punitive, at least in our state. And we have statistics about that in Germany, and there are some very many courts with very low punitivity. That's usually in North Germany, some in South Germany as well. There's also been research about the reasons why that might be so, but with no results that you could draw any conclusions from. So what do you answer these victim support people, or maybe also victims of crime, who expect that something happens to their perpetrator?
I have no argument with the need for accountability for offending. And I've got no argument with the need for appropriate measures to be taken to protect people where there's a genuine either vulnerability or a dangerousness that has to be kind of somehow contained or managed. The problem is, in the Scottish case, there's no evidence that the expansion in the scale of penal control was related to crime problems in the first instance. Rather, I think it was related to a misconceived policy that assumed, well, first of all, it assumed that supervision and community sanctions were good things, and that by doing more of them, we would produce good social outcomes. Good outcomes for the person subject to supervision, good outcomes for the victim or potential victim, good outcomes for the community. And an effective and efficient system of community sanctions would deliver all sorts of social goods and reduce the prison population. That was the dream. Okay, so it clearly failed on the prison population reduction issue, and that was because we didn't pay enough attention to targeting those measures properly. But what we also missed, and what's actually, I would say, the absolutely core point of the book, particularly in chapter 5, is that just because we think the sanction that we're delivering in the community is going to be supportive and helpful and constructive and productive does not mean that it doesn't hurt. So to understand this, you only have to ask yourself the question, how would you like to be under supervision? How would you like to wear an electronic tag? How would you like to have a stranger visit your house once a week and talk to you about yourself, your life, your circumstances, your behaviour, your past, your most shameful misdeeds? How would you like a person who comes from the state with authority to have the power to talk to your family about you, or to talk to your employer about you? So once we start kind of thinking about what it feels like to be supervised, it doesn't take us very long to realise that there are invasions of privacy. There's a certain kind of infantilization associated with being a subject of supervision. There's a lot of time demands that are placed on people to be in certain places at certain times. There's a demand for a certain kind of openness, which isn't comfortable or easy for everybody. There are restrictions on movements, on liberty. So there are all sorts of pains of supervision, even if it's being done well by a sympathetic social worker who's well trained, who wants to provide support, and who pays attention to using their authority in the most legitimate way possible. So even in the perfect case, supervision still hurts. Mm-hmm. And if you don't pay attention to that, then you've got no reason to restrain the use of it. And I think in Scotland and in most systems, it sounds like this would also apply in Germany, people haven't been sufficiently alert to the fact that this is a sanction. And it hurts in and of itself. It also hurts even more if it's breached or revoked, which, you know, can lead to imprisonment. So when we use coercive power, which is what we're talking about here, when we use coercive power to intervene in the lives of citizens, we are doing harm, unavoidably, and we may need to do that for the benefit of victims or the benefit of communities, and it may be legitimate to do that. That doesn't remove the harm. So we always have to think, I would say, think first about the harm and whether or not it's justified, and how it's justified. And then if a court is satisfied that it's necessary and justified, then we can ask the question, okay, knowing that we're doing harm, how can we also do good? And how can we try to minimize the harms while we do that? So yeah, I think that we just have to accept and confront this difficult reality, which I would have denied, like in all my years as a social worker, and actually for the first 10 or 15 years of my time as an academic researcher, I don't think I recognized or understood the painful side of supervision. It was only when I started engaging with ethnographic research specifically that got close to what people were experiencing. And then specifically when we started using creative methods to allow people freedom to express their own emotions and their own experiences, that I started to see findings that I found shocking. And that kind of disrupted my mistaken comfort about supervision being a generally good idea.
Okay, we're coming to that second aspect of creative measures in a minute. What I would like to ask you about, what might be the practical consequence of your research? I mean, every judge we talk to today who we would have invited here would say, well, the things you demand is exactly what I'm doing. I have a very close look at the case. I have a look at how severe is the criminal offense and what might be the best thing to do with the offender. That's, I think, what every judge would say. And from a political point of view, if we don't have a sophisticated and well-established and financed probation system, even if it hasn't worked in the past, how can we reduce incarceration rates?
I'm not against those systems. Yeah. I'm still an advocate of probation services. I'm not an advocate of their careless expansion. Yeah, that's my core point. So
who are the people who are careless? You very often in the book you use the term unnecessary, but what exactly is unnecessary?
Well, I mean, I'm making that judgment in the Scottish context and in the American context because the evidence suggests that the expansion of penal control is not justified by the existence of a larger or a more serious crime problem. So at a general level, not at the level of individual cases, and that I'll come back to that, but at a general level, it looks as if we have been careless in the expansion of the use of coercion with a larger number of people, and bear in mind that the populations that we draw into these systems are already disadvantaged, and that drawing them into these systems disadvantages them further.
It's not the professor who offends the law, but it's other people, yeah.
Yes, indeed. That's right. As I said in the first half, I get away with it. Yeah. So I think at the general level, the case is fairly unanswerable. But I take your point. Like when I speak to judges in Scotland, they say, "Well, of course, we always use these measures as a last resort." Well, I'm not a judge, and I should approach a dialogue with judges with a measure of humility, because they are the ones that carry the responsibility for making tough decisions. But the evidence is that the threshold of, I don't know what the right word is, the threshold of seriousness that draws somebody in to systems of supervision, and then beyond that into systems of custody, those thresholds have come down, and the level of restrictions that people are subject to once over the threshold is greater.
But that's something that happened without any changes in the law.
No, I think that well, there have been legal changes and they've had some influence, but I think it's largely to do with more social and cultural dynamics of the sort that actually are discussed in the second chapter of the book. So the sociologists of punishment write a great deal about the emergence of a culture of control in late modern societies, the central preoccupation with risk, how that changes things. They write about populist punitiveness, the kind of the mood changing in late modern societies. And I think that although it's difficult to kind of trace the mechanisms by which those bigger social and cultural currents produce changes in practice, the evidence is that they have altered these thresholds in ways which have drawn more and more people into these systems. And the point of the book is to surface that and to challenge it and to say this is a problem, it's expensive, it's ineffective in many cases, it's damaging in the lives of many people. It doesn't make sense in terms of the criminological evidence, and we could do better, also from a human rights perspective. So I guess I'm doing what academics do. I'm trying to challenge the kind of the system in which I find myself, or the systems in which I find myself, and ask politicians, policymakers, practitioners and others to just pause and think carefully about how these systems are operating and whether we couldn't do a bit better. So the book articulates some principles around parsimony and proportionality and productiveness, which we could talk about if you like, but there's also a kind of a bigger and broader debate to be had about the way in which we rely on criminal justice as a way of managing or responding to conflict and harm in society. And I think that we're a little bit addicted to the state as the solution to these problems, and I don't think it does a terrifically good job for victims.
Probably.
Or for people who offend.
Maybe this is a good point to switch to the second aspect of your book that I really appreciate, and it's about creativity and bringing across things you scientifically talk about in a different way. Like you constructed your book around, or the other way around, I don't know, around a short story. It's the invisible collar, so this makes your book very easily understandable also for people who are not reading scientific literature every day. I think it's a very good idea, but it goes further than just this short story for this one book. Yep. Your approach goes further. It also goes into music and also writing, yep. And also, as far as I understood it, taking into account the stories the people who have lived experience yep. Tell themselves. And yep. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Yeah,
so as I've kind of already said, the creative method shocked me out of my complacency about what supervision was. But more generally, I wanted to write a book that would be accessible and which had ways of closing the gap between those with experience and those without experience. And actually, it was the short story came from a conversation with my wife. She's a teacher. She loves fiction, she's well-read and cultured person, but she's not interested in criminology, not remotely really interested in criminology. She has she knows about my work, as you might expect, but she's not particularly curious about the things I write about. So as I started writing this book, I said to her, half joking, what would make it interesting for you? I'd quite like you to read this book. And she's like, well, I like stories. And I thought about it for a while, and I was actually on a train coming home from a criminology conference, and I thought, okay, I'll write her a story and see what she makes of it. So I wrote the first episode of The Invisible Collar on that train and gave it to her when I got home and said, well, what do you think of this? And she said, well, I want to know more. So it had worked in the sense that a lay person had engaged with a story about supervision and had become curious about it. And that was the whole thing, basically. I wanted to spark curiosity. And then the photographs and the songs are, to me, ways of, as research methods, they were ways of allowing people to explore and express their own emotions and experiences without being confined by interview questions or by the constructs already in the mind of the questioner. Again, I stumbled on those methods almost by accident. So the photographs, for example, I was leading a European research network between 2012 and 2016 that spanned 23 countries, and we were trying to create an attractive website. And we hit upon the problem that nobody had any good pictures that conveyed anything very meaningful about probation or supervision. So rather than sort of using the PR photos from different probation services, we decided to do a little pilot project, 2 pilot projects in fact, one with practitioners where we asked them to take pictures that represented the work, and one with people subject to supervision where we asked them to represent their experience. And we did some of that work in Germany, the second part, some in Scotland, some in England, and we ended up with a few hundred pictures, which we discussed with the people who took the pictures, but we also analysed the images themselves, and they were vivid and stark and quite distressing, many of them. Images of constraint, images that often centred on time and conveyed a sense of being in limbo, or time being suspended or lost. Lots of images of waste, rubbish in the streets, toilets, which people said was about a feeling of their lives being wasted or them being literally shit, human waste. And also a really powerful and recurring theme around judgment, the feeling of being judged and stigmatized by that judgment. And then there was one subset of more positive images, which were kind of images of growth and development. But actually in all 5 of those domains, there were kind of ambiguous elements. To be constrained is also to be held, and sometimes to be held is comforting. To have time suspended can also be a time out. A holiday is time suspended in a good way. Sometimes getting rid of waste is cleansing and part of moving on in your life. And although growth is a nice thing, it's also painful for most of us. So judgment, interestingly, was the only theme that went in one direction only, the negative direction only, but it was very powerfully expressed, and also powerfully expressed when we took the photographs into songwriting workshops and then got more people with lived experience to kind of write songs that communicated their experience. And I just found those methods incredibly powerful for getting a kind of a more unfiltered account of what supervision felt like. And the book kind of goes into that in chapter 5, using the creative methods, using also other people's ethnographic studies. And it tries to be balanced, because I give examples of good and bad practice experiences mediated through songs. But I've used all 3 of those creative methods with my students subsequently, and I asked them in a course I run here to write a reflective essay prompted by how they react to the stimuli, and then I asked them to reflect on their own experience of being supervised in any context of life, from parental supervision to workplace supervision to academic supervision, and I say, reflect on that experience and then compare the 2 experiences of penal supervision and non-penal supervision. And they write the most wonderful essays where they are kind of deeply thoughtful about what it might be like to be subject to this power, state power, mediated through supervision. And I feel as if that approach succeeds in drawing them close as close as they can get to the experience of a person on supervision. And then when they write traditional essays at the end of the course, they're better. They're just better because they've comprehended in a way which is felt as well as thought. Yeah. And I think that all the way through the book I'm trying to do that with the reader. I'm not trying to manipulate the reader, I hope, but I am trying to make the reader feel things while they're also thinking.
Yeah. I think it's very good to understand the book, really, but it's also two different topics. I would say the academic who writes a short story or even creates a song, you're a musician as well, or a student who I would expect in a way to be able to write a short story, good or bad one. But what about the people who are under supervision? As you said, we usually have to do with marginalized people with a lot of, problems. Those kinds of creative work like songwriting and story writing, I would think would be only applicable for a small minority of clients. Yeah?
Well, I mean, surprisingly, maybe that hasn't been my experience. I mean, I can't rule out the fact that there might have been some selection effects. The short story, I should say, is just me. So that's me fictionalizing, essentially fictionalizing what I know about supervision from all of my experience and research. The photography, people found their way to we handed out disposable cameras, or we used digital photography, and people just, literally they left this building in one of the Scottish workshops, and they came back an hour and a half later with amazing images, and we had rich conversations, and we had a photographer who briefed them on some sort of basics of photographic composition, and also we talked about the kind of ethical issues of not putting themselves or any other identifiable person in the picture, and how to, some of them used shadows as a way to put people in the frame but not identifiable. So, people had the capacity to do it. And when it comes to songwriting, again, my experience is that anybody who's willing and brave enough to have a go can write a song with support. So the songwriting is collaborative, where we put an experienced musician and songwriter alongside a person with lived experience, and then they're trying to kind of help them imagine and write a song that is both lyrically authentic in terms of their experience, but is also musically aligned with their tastes and sensibilities. So in the case of the song Blank Face, which is central to the book, I asked TJ, who I was writing with, what music do you like, and what music do you imagine goes with this story? And he said, oh, it's got to be some kind of lament, a rising lament. And then he played me something. I wish I could remember what he played me, but he had music on his phone. He played me a song, and I kind of sat with that for a bit, and then I played around on the guitar, and I played something back to him and said, do you mean a bit like this? And he said, yeah, something like that. And so over the course of a couple of days, that's the to and fro of songwriting, where you're kind of exchanging ideas, and what you try to do is make the person who's bringing the life experience the editor of your contribution as a musician. And when you use creative methods, there's a third thing in the room. So rather than this dynamic back and forward, you're both looking over here at the thing that you're making, and something interesting happens in terms of how people feel freer to explore and take risks and be vulnerable.
I think everything you said about these creative approaches makes a lot of sense, and if I get you right, it would also be an approach that you would recommend to practitioners to use creative methods to get in contact with their clients, and this has a lot of advantages. Also makes maybe the voice of people with lived experience heard, and it can also be a means of getting in contact in a better way with your clients. But then you'd have you need some competency, you need some skills for that as well. Yeah?
Or some partners who have those skills. So, not everybody has to be a musician or a songwriter or a photographer, but you'd find some of them who might collaborate with you. The other benefit I would add, and I think this is really important, is when you have these artworks of whatever form, you also have a medium of public communication. Mm-hmm. And we have, in Scotland, we've used some of the work, particularly the songwriting. We've taken songs to public audiences. We've released records and had mainstream media coverage in a way which I think has had some success in causing people just to pause and think a little bit more deeply, including about how the lives of people caught up in the criminal justice system, it turns out, are not so very different from their own, mm-hmm. and the struggles that they face with love and loss and grief and whatever are universal human struggles, and that kind of diminishing of the social distance between people, I think, is a tremendously important thing to do, especially in the times in which we live. So I think these methods are also a way for probation practitioners and probation services to think about engagement with civil society, broadly speaking. I'm just back from Singapore, as we were discussing earlier, and I'm convinced more and more that in Asian countries, probation services and prison services are doing a better job of connecting with civil society and with communities than we are in the West. Mm. We've professionalised criminal justice to such an extent that beyond involving what is already a very professionalised third sector, we're not really, I know Germany might be doing better, but in Scotland we're not using volunteers very much. Mm-hmm. We're not making criminal justice or community justice the business of communities, and that feeds into public ignorance, public misunderstanding, and I would argue also ultimately punitiveness. So I think we need to get a lot better at community engagement, public engagement, and that creative methods provide one useful way of doing some of that work.
Yeah. And if I may, I'd also recommend your fellow academics to maybe write short stories and make their theories better understandable for people who don't read scientific literature every day. So I think thank you very much for that. Maybe one last question. Mm-hmm. I ask everybody. It's maybe a little populistic, but I would like to hear from you in one sentence, what do offenders need in order to desist from crime?
That's a very hard question to answer in one sentence, but I think...
what's the most important thing?
I think the most important thing in the long term, if we're talking about securing desistance as a settled state, what people need is the prospect of and the realisation of a place of belonging, which is rewarding and in which people are enabled to flourish and lead lives which are good for them and good for people around them. I think if you deny people belonging and continue to marginalise and exclude them, then you're very likely to frustrate any potential for desistance that exists.
Okay, thank you very much, Fergus, for the insights.